Very good. Is all okay?
Yes, we can start.
Okay. Welcome everyone officially to today's webinar, and to all of you who have joined us from Asia and Europe for this webinar on the Science Diplomacy Entry Points, which is our third out of 4 webinars as part of the series Young Minds, Global Bridges, Discovering the Power of Science Diplomacy. We're very excited to see again so many of you joining us today. Some might have already participated in our sessions beforehand. Some of you might be joining us for the first time. Either way, very much welcome. We're excited to discuss more about different points of science diplomacy, especially related to entry points, as the title suggests, initiatives that you can get involved in, and how you can start planning your perhaps career within this field. We're very happy to be organizing this series in partnership with the Central European Scientific Society of Innovation and Technology, or CESIT for short. I myself come from the Asia Europe Foundation. My name is Linnea Regnell, and I work as a senior project executive at ASEF in our education department, where science and technology diplomacy is a project where we focus specifically on youth and young professionals like yourself. I'm very excited to be the one that will be guiding you through today's session and moderating the panel dialogue later. So let me just give you a brief overview on what we have ahead of us for the next 1.5 hours. First, I'll give, as I mentioned, a brief introduction to ASEF as an organization and this webinar series, so contextualizing it a little bit in relation to the work that we do in the foundation. And then after that, we'll delve directly into our panel dialogue and Q&A with our speakers and distinguished guests today. They will be able to share their insights in perspectives on, as mentioned, the entry points to science diplomacy, initiatives, perhaps a little bit about the drive and the skills that you need to have to take on different activities in this field, and then also give you perhaps a bit of encouragement on where you can start mapping out your own path in science diplomacy. And then we'll close off and look ahead for our next and final session next week. For the panel dialogue and Q&A, as we've mentioned in previous sessions before, you cannot unmute yourself or show your video. So for you to ask any questions, you will have to utilize the Q&A function, which is available on the tool bar in Zoom. You can use this to pose your questions, upvote any ones that you find particularly interesting and you want us to pay attention to. But you can also answer them yourself and engage in discussions. Beyond this, you can also use the chat function to perhaps introduce yourself, connect with others. In previous sessions, we've seen participants share their LinkedIns, a little bit about themselves, and connect that way so that you can also start building your networks between the 2 regions. So without further ado, allow me to give the overview of ASEF, for those of you who are not familiar, and of our initiative. So perhaps many of you know, but for those that don't, ASEF, or the Asia Europe Foundation, is an intergovernmental organization who works with strengthening mutual understanding between Asia and Europe. And we do this across a number of different thematic areas. We do it, of course, in education, where I work, but we also do it across culture, governance, media, sustainable development, economy, public health, just to name a few. And through this, we facilitate dialogue between civil society itself, but also between governmental and civil society stakeholders to strengthen collaboration between the 2 regions to solve global challenges and work towards common goals. And recently, the Asia Europe Foundation has been working within our education department on the topic of science and technology diplomacy. And we've been doing so since 2024. When we conducted a mapping exercise to map the existing strategies and tools, stakeholders, and activities in our member countries, and produce a report from this, which you can access on our website, and I will share later also in our chat for your access. Following this report, in 2025, so just as of last year, we organized a number of different activities, starting out with a country-focused workshop series where we spotlighted a number of countries who are actively contributing to the field of science and technology diplomacy, but may not have the spotlight on them always in the global arena. And this is to promote, again, further understanding of the stakeholders involved within government, academia, and also within private sector and businesses for us to understand how the ecosystems work, both within countries, but also how they intersect on the global arena, as mentioned. We also organized the first Asia-Europe Training and Youth Summit on Science and Technology Diplomacy. And the Youth Summit was organized alongside the second European Science Diplomacy Conference in Copenhagen, Denmark, just this past December, where also participants were able to deliver a youth declaration on the youth perspectives on science and technology diplomacy to the relevant senior officials at the meeting. So this all brings us here today, where we have the opportunity to bring you in as youth, to really provide a foundation for you to get a better understanding of science and technology. Previously, we've mainly engaged young professionals, those already in their professional careers, beginning a couple of years in government and also within research. But with the interest that we saw last year of youth and students like yourself to also participate and be involved in this, we couldn't give up the opportunity to organize a webinar series for you in particular, to give you the opportunity to learn directly from experts, engage with one another, and start perhaps thinking on how you want to pursue further dialogues, but also collaborations in the field. So that's a little bit about the project, but I know you're here to not hear me talk a lot about science and technology diplomacy. You're here to hear from our speakers. So without further ado, allow me to transition into our panel dialogue and Q&A and introduce you to our speakers today. I saw he just joined us here as well, so let's hope that camera and everything is working. But first, let me introduce to you Professor Renaud Jolivet, who is a full professor and chair of the Neutral Engineering and Computation at Maastricht University. Here, his work focuses on cellular neuroscience and on neurotechnologies to interface with brain tissue. A lot of probably things that I can explain more, but I'm not very much familiar myself, coming from a social science background. But prior to working in the Netherlands, Renaud has worked in Switzerland, Japan, and the UK. He has previously served on the boards of the Initiative for Science in Europe, the Marie Curie Alumni Association, and also the Organization for Computational Neuroscience, and was a 2023 Neurotech Fellow for the Foresight Institute, as well as the inaugural chair of the Science and Technology Committee of eBrains, the European Research Infrastructure for Neurosciences. He's currently a stakeholder representative for individual researchers and innovators at the European Commission's ERA Forum, and he is also a recipient of the Marie Curie Alumni Association Career Award in 2022 and of the André Mischke Young Academy of the Europe Prize for Science and Policy same year. So we're very excited for Renaud to be joining us today. Thank you so much for being here with us. Our second panelist joining us is an alumni also of one of our projects here at ASEF, so previously participated also in our initiatives related to science and technology diplomacy, Ms. Kochapan Bomonshayat, who is a policy developer at the Office of National Higher Education, Science, Research and Innovation Policy Council of Thailand. Her work sits directly at the intersection of science, technology, and innovation policy, also related to data governance and international policy engagement. She has contributed to regional and international initiatives through research, stakeholder dialogue, and cross-border collaboration, and previously served as the country informant from our first report from the Asia-Europe Science and Technology Diplomacy report that I mentioned in the beginning. And also, as of last year, as our rapporteur for our country-focused workshop series. But beyond our engaging with us, she's also been Thailand's national delegate to OECD's Working Party of National Experts on Science and Technology Indicators, or NESTI for short. She was also a panelist at the World Forum, Science Forum in 2024 on the future of Asia-Europe science diplomacy, and holds a background in science and technology policy from the University of Sussex. Thank you so much, Koshapam, for being with us here. Our third panelist is joining us from a very different time zone. He's joining us all the way from the US today, so we're very grateful for him for being here. Mr. Dimitris Bofidis, who is a PhD candidate in bioengineering at the University of Pennsylvania, where he works at the intersection of neutral tissue engineering and bioelectronics, developing neurotechnologies to restore brain functions after disease. So I think a bit of an overlap, perhaps also with journals and the connections there. Beyond the lab, he serves as a science diplomacy chair of the Penn Science Policy and Diplomacy Group, which we'll also go into a little bit more today in our discussions, where he leads initiatives connecting STEM research with international policy, diplomacy, and global cooperation. He has developed science diplomacy programming, workshops, and training for graduate students. So listen in, he might have a lot to teach you here today. While also building flagship experiential learning opportunities and partnerships with embassies, diplomats, and science and policy leaders. Originally from Greece, he graduated top of his class from University of Sheffield, where he received also the 2022 Chancellor's Medal. He's been a TEDx speaker and committed STEM advocate. His research has also been featured in The Guardian and BBC News. So very exciting. Thank you so much, Dimitris, for waking up so early to be with us here today. And our fourth and final panelist, last but definitely not least, we have Ms. Hanna Schoch, who is the previous secretary of the European Council of Doctoral Candidates and Junior Researchers, or as many of you might be more familiar with it, Eurodoc, from 2022 to 2025. She still contributes to Eurodoc's policy and advocacy work on a wide array of topics, including academic freedom, the EHEA fundamental values, and the democratic mission of research and higher education. Together with Pil Maria Saubman, Hanna has co-designed and developed the Eurodoc Ambassadors Program, Values and Democracy in European Higher Education and Research, and is now, which is now running in its second iteration. She has also worked and is currently on the board of RECHT, which is I might pronounce that wrong, I apologize, which is a non-profit association in Switzerland facilitating conversations between science, society, and politics. Thank you so much, Hanna, for being with us here today. With those maybe long-winded introductions, I will also now actually hand over the floor to our panelists to introduce themselves and give a little bit of an introduction to their work as we kick off today's panel dialogue. So I will go also in the order that I see on the screen, which will also be the order that I introduced you all. So Professor Renaud, if you would like to start out, introducing yourself a little bit, how did you get involved in science diplomacy? And what would you like to start off sharing with our participants here today?
Yes, hello everyone. So first, thanks all for the invitation. And sorry I was a bit late. I was teaching until 10. So my introduction to science diplomacy is rather late. So I had a typical academic career. So I trained as a physicist, then as a neuroscientist, I did what you usually do as an academic. So after my PhD, I did a number of postdocs. I traveled abroad, and my motivation for social engagement, let's say, was that I come from a blue-collar background, and I always thought that there are many unwritten rules in academia. And so I always thought to myself, if I make it to a faculty position, I would dedicate some time to mentoring early career researchers like myself so that they don't have to do the mistakes that I did. So when I got my first faculty position in Geneva, I got very engaged in the Marie Curie Alumni Association because I had a fellowship back then. And so my initial motivation was really mentoring early career researchers. But then this sort of took a life of itself. So as I was getting more and more engaged in the association, I got introduced to maybe a broader perspective on science policy. And as I was taking more responsibility in the association, it's sort of I accidentally landed one engagement after the next into being quite engaged in science policy and science diplomacy, mostly in the European landscape. And that culminated in that role at the ERA Forum that you mentioned, where in fact I am not really active in that role anymore, only for one subtask of it. So it's actually Pil, the colleague of Anna, who has taken over from me. And yeah, and that sort of bounced back into my own career, where I also I got more engaged into leadership roles in my scientific community, and I acted as the chair of the Science and Technology Committee of eBrains, which in some sense you could say is a little bit of science diplomacy, but from the scientific side rather. So that's for my career trajectory. Yeah, and I'm a professor in Maastricht, and I mostly work on neurotechnologies and cellular neuroscience, really. And then I wanted to say maybe a few. Yeah, so that's how I got introduced to science diplomacy. And that's what I did, was really being active in my community and also being active at a more global level in the European context, which has some specificities, but maybe I can leave that for later, and I will stop here with my introduction.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. So perhaps a bit of an accident, but maybe also
definitely
a bit of intention in the active engagement in your field.
It looks coherent now, but I definitely didn't when I did it. Let's put it like this.
Yeah. Let's see if that echoes also the sentiments of our other speakers. Kochapan, would you like to share a little bit about how you got introduced to science diplomacy?
Yeah, my name is Kochapan Bowachirit. I'm from Thailand, and I work as a policy developer, which is actually the policy researcher at Thailand's the Office of National Higher Education, Science Research and Innovation Policy Council. Basically, it's a STI policy office of Thailand, and my work focuses on science, technology, and innovation policy. And data governance, policy monitoring, and international cooperation as well. And I also serve as one of the Thailand's national delegates to the OECD Working Party on ISTI, as Linia just introduced me. And I would say that my introduction to science diplomacy came quite gradually through practice rather than through a formal academic pathway. Because at first I did not label my work as a science diplomacy, but I was working on SCI policy, basically, and sometimes engage with the regional cooperation regarding the data capacity building, international policy discussion. But over time, I just realized that many of these activities were actually parts of the broader science diplomacy ecosystem. And for me, science diplomacy is more about like what the intersection between science, technology, evidence-based policy, and international cooperation came together. And it is from my experience, I and I just think like it's not only about the formal negotiation between the diplomats anymore. Since science and technology become more emerging and become the bigger fields for today, and it happens around the many people like myself, like a technical or official researcher or international organization, university or private sector actors and young people that work together to address the shared challenges. And as Linnea introduced me at the very beginning, that I am a part of the Asia Europe Foundation's initiative. So that is make me more clear about how I introduced to this field. Yeah, I gotta stop here. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Coach Stefan. And thank you so much for continuing to engage with us since 2024 and now also giving back to a new round of participants through your engagement. Next on my screen is Dimitris. Would you like to share a little bit about your path to science diplomacy?
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are in the world. And thank you, Lina and ASEF, for inviting me here. I'm very glad to be among great panelists. And it is really meaningful for me to join this conversation, especially because ASEF has also been part of my own science diplomacy journey. I'm also an alumni of the programs. I was at the Science Diplomacy Youth Summit last December in Denmark that Lina mentioned in the introductions. And to echo the previous panelists, my path into this field was also not planned. I moved from Greece to the United States around 4 years ago to begin my doctoral studies in bioengineering at the University of Pennsylvania in the US, where I'm now a PhD candidate. And at the time, I didn't know that science diplomacy even existed as a phrase. I cared about science, I cared about international cooperation, I cared about how research could serve society, but I did not have a language for that space between science policy and international relations. And that changed when I joined the Penn Science Policy and Diplomacy Group, and a few years later, here I am, serving as the Science Diplomacy Chair. I can go into further detail if you want later, but we're basically developing science diplomacy programming for graduate students and early career scientists. And we're trying to build these concrete entry points into the field. Apart from my work with the Penn Science Policy and Diplomacy Group, I'm also working to build science diplomacy capacity in Greece through a new network I founded called Greeks in Science Diplomacy. This has also been particularly exciting because we're basically helping to create the entire ecosystem in Greece. And I'm happy to go into more details of that as well, if that would be of interest for our attendees today. And given how many students we have, I think it would be nice just to close my introduction to also start by sharing some of the skills that I think are most important for engaging in the science diplomacy ecosystem. So I would like to highlight three to start us off. The first one is communication, because science diplomacy requires translation between scientists, policymakers, and diplomats. So we need this constant translation of messages. The second one that I want to highlight is intercultural awareness. So not only understanding different national cultures, but also different institutional cultures, disciplinary cultures, different power structures, because a university and an embassy or a ministry and a laboratory do not operate in the same way. And the last one that I want to highlight is initiative. As we know, and you've probably been hearing this in the previous training sessions as well, there is no single formal pathway to science diplomacy. And this can be frustrating, but it creates space for us, for students to build stuff. So my sort of advice would be to reach out to people, ask questions, maybe start a science diplomacy group at your university or join if there is already one, to invite a speaker. And you might be surprised by how willing senior professionals are to talk to students. So yeah, these are my intro remarks. We don't need to have the title of science diplomat before starting, useful science diplomacy work. So who knows, maybe you will find yourself in the near future in the exciting spot of creating entry points for others.
Very lovely to start, already being encouraging for our participants. Thank you so much, Demetrius. Last but not least, Hannah, would you like to share a little bit about your path?
Yes, I guess much of it will also echo what has been said, and in a sense that also just underlines what is maybe a common experience. I maybe rather than, or to spin it a bit positively, rather than always talking about the accidental and the haphazard kind of how you end up in this, So I started very locally at my own university in kind of representational work, higher education, politics, and then from there it just built, and I went to the national level and then ended up international with Eurodoc. And I think at some point what also Dimitris and Renaud have kind of highlighted, it's like you have to start getting engaged somewhere. And then it's from that you kind of move forward. And no, it's not a kind of laid out path, but there you kind of build from that. And then you're just, it's a question of, how whether time and opportunity and the moment kind of come together. But there are so many opportunities also, to get engaged once. You just have to have a bit of curiosity. And maybe if you're talking about skills, it's not necessarily a skill. But I think in all of this, curiosity is extremely valuable. Be curious about the possibility, but also about the people that you engage with. And from there, you can really build and find out how the ecosystem works, how a specific section of the ecosystem works, but also connect to people. So for me, it was really kind of, again, also that building up and gaining experience. Very bluntly, it's like the more experience you have, the other possibilities you have. And I think this has been mentioned a couple of times now. It's one way to think about all the official science diplomacy, or the official in that sense of it's the diplomats engaging with and the embassy engaging with. But there is also so much space around that that is equally important, if not in a sense providing the ground for that official work then to be able to happen. And here I do think associations like this year providing learning experiences like these, MCAA, Eurodoc is kind of also in that sense, not just out towards the outside, kind of connecting with stakeholders, policymakers, but also in what they do at its core, namely connecting across country, internationally, across disciplines. It's kind of the ground on which much of science diplomacy, science policy is happening ultimately. So in a sense, getting started is often much closer to home than the vast unknown out there. And so maybe, with that, it's, I mean, in Eurodoc, one, for me, maybe one, yes, I engage with the Council of Europe, with the ERA, like on that level, but maybe the thing that I find almost most remarkable is that we connect researchers from so many different countries in Europe. And we engage with them and learn about what even are we as a research community, where are we coming from? And from that are then able to kind of also reach out more coherently to policymakers. Maybe with that, I'm gonna echo Dimitris with also closing two more skills that I would like to add. And one is really the willingness to put in, again, they're not really skills, but more so like the things, do them, to really understand the ecosystem that you're moving into. And part of that is understanding how politics works, how the structures are, what policy frameworks are you working within. So, because otherwise there's kind of, it's also a question of respect towards all the other people doing the work in that sphere, that you not just come in and say, hey, and I want to do it like this now, but there's so many people engaged in this and putting in work. And so understanding where you are in this ecosystem is always very valuable. And basically, really, it's kind of just the work that you need to do. And the other one is to kind of add to communication, I would say maybe even more importantly, it's listening. Being able to listen, to hear where the other people stand, where the other institution stands, and from that then being able to engage in a conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Hannah. And I think what you mentioned now just at the end on listening also really comes in with the curiosity that you mentioned in the beginning. In order to truly be curious about someone else, you need to also try and to listen, to hear them properly, to understand. Thank you very much. I will encourage participants already to start putting your questions in the chat. And I know you're already putting questions, but more directed towards me on the logistical points of things. If you have questions in relation to your participation in the webinar series, you can always email us at scitech@asef.org. I'll send the email also in the chat, but take the opportunity to also ask questions to our speakers here today. And I'll kick us off with some questions, but if you start putting them in the Q&A, I'll try to intersperse them also in the next 50 minutes or so that we have available. So perhaps then building on what you mentioned, Hannah, I will, on understanding the ecosystem, I'll pose a question to Professor Renaud. As someone who has engaged within Europe a lot in understanding the research ecosystem, perhaps mainly, but the ecosystem and all of the stakeholders are involved can be very complex to understand and perhaps intimidating for someone who doesn't know where to begin to do this research that Hannah mentioned. So also as a professor who helps guide people in their understanding, do you have perhaps any tips for our attendees here today on how they can tackle this challenge and start to understand what the stakeholders are involved? And could you perhaps share a little bit about your understanding also of the system?
Yeah, so in the European landscape, and I suspect it is the same in other large research ecosystems, the science policy or diplomacy landscape is incredibly fragmented. And that was quite surprising to me because I had not anticipated that. So as I said, I had a typical academic career, and so I got in late into these activities. And so all of a sudden you realize you have all of these organizations and associations representing various stakeholders that are involved in negotiating on your behalf, supposedly with the European authorities and or with the national governments. And there's not always, as several have said, I think that there's not always a clear structure or path through which you can go to get a summer. It's not organized. It's very organic, right? You have all these organizations out there. And it's only by practicing, I think, or by being involved in that space that you progressively get a sort of a exhaustive picture of who is there and what kind of entities they represent. My impression is that in North America and Canada and the US, it used to be more organized. I'm saying used to be because I think a lot of that infrastructure is being dismantled by the Trump administration. But there were entities like the NIH, for instance, the National Institute of Health, or where there was a clear connection between, I would say, the academics who lead these organizations and cabinet level officials in the presidential administration. In Europe, it's very messy because you have many different entities. You have member states and the European Commission that all work in concert. It's very difficult to get a sense of who is in charge, if anyone is in charge. And you have a lot of organizations that comes from the academic world. So this would be university associations. There's a lot of them. Associations of universities of applied sciences, technical libraries. You have a lot of researcher organizations, a lot of umbrella organizations that collect a lot of learned societies, for instance. And then you have lobby groups, by lack of a better word, that represent research-intensive industries, sometimes national academies. So it's extremely disparate. And the landscape changes from country to country. And so you have many different stakeholders. The forum in which I was active at the European Commission, the ERA Forum, I think there are 7 or 9 stakeholder groups. In each one of these groups, you have between 3 and 20 organizations that are part of that stakeholder group. And these stakeholder groups are big categories that the Commission came up with. And so it's unless you navigate in that space, I found that it was difficult to get a clear sense. And I don't think this is very conducive. It's very efficient because you have many different voices, and there's a lack of organization from our community, which sometimes gives space to, I would say, the Commission or the member states to do a bit what they want, because there's always a lack of alignment on central issues. Every university association is going to advocate for something different, which is usually what the 15 or 16 universities that are represented in that association think is their specific interest. And I found that rather frustrating as an academic, because I think that no one is willing to compromise, and it creates our communication to the authorities is very inefficient in that regard. And so it's difficult to give a clear view of who is out there, because, as I said, it's very disparate, it's very fragmented. And you have to be regularly in Brussels, essentially, if you want to be active in that space at the European level. You have to be regularly or ideally permanently in Brussels and engage in as many activities as possible. And eventually, over, a couple of months or a year, you will get some kind of a view of the landscape. But even after 4 years I was active in the ERA firm, I still discovered new organizations I'd never heard of before. So I think it's very difficult to give a complete list. And the fact that there is no real clear connection or path in science policy between, I would say, the European authorities and the academic world, I think is a major issue for science policy in Europe. And again, my sense, but maybe this is naive, is that this is or was better organized in the United States, for instance. And where you have national academies, you have sort of a national academies and national institutes that sort of act as a natural contact point or pathway between cabinet level officials and the academic world, and that doesn't really exist in Europe, or not in exactly the same terms. Yeah. And I think so. What was your other question? Sorry, I'm ranting and I forgot what you asked.
No worries at all. No, so of course, sharing a little bit, as you mentioned, about your understanding of the ecosystem, but then knowing that there are so many entry points, perhaps would you then recommend that
yeah,
involved in my own research institutions, that I go from there? I see which research institutions with how to
yeah. So if I was a student today and I wanted to make a career in that landscape, I would think. So first of all, I think my and maybe I'm a bit biased there because I'm a scientist, but I think you need to bring some expertise to the table, which is either technical field expertise in a field of research or in an academic field, or some kind of diplomatic expertise or expertise in policy, having an understanding of how power structures function in a government. And I think Dimitris mentioned that this is really very different to what you would experience in a university, and having an understanding of how policies are crafted and shaped in a government or in an embassy. And the entry point then, I think, will depend a bit what kind of trajectory you choose. But if you are a scientist or an engineer, I would think that an early career researcher association like the association Anna is representing would be a perfect entry point, because these organizations now, at least in Europe, have a sort of, that connection has been made, I think, to the commission officials. And that would be the natural path, going through trying to be elected into a young academy, and these sort of organizations would be the natural way to get engaged. I think the thing you have to realize is that this is going to take quite a bit of time, and so it has to be balanced with your maybe other constraints or career constraints. So even for myself, I mean, this was kind of a massive investment in terms of time for the last 10 years or so.
Yeah. Thank you very much. But then perhaps one thing can be said that when you're as an audience here joining us, you're still young. You can start out now, and then in 10 years' time, you have already so much time also the rest of your career to work within this field. So the sooner, the better to get involved as well. But then perhaps let's jump to Hannah in relation also to Eurodoc, of course, as an organization brings together early career researchers. I know that at least from my side, and perhaps I'm being biased here, I'm very much interested in research, and I think that of course many people here perhaps are as well. But when we're looking at those that are interested in pursuing research careers, and perhaps also in this overlap between research, science policy, diplomacy, as well as when we're talking about science diplomacy as a somewhat umbrella term of a field, say. How can we encourage people to pursue these careers, and what is available for them, and how can we make sure that people not just enter into the field with the idea of working within their sector, but also then interdisciplinary, where we are seeing these connections between different scientific fields, diplomacy, and the governmental sector as well?
I think maybe almost the most important aspect to this comes back to what Renaud said at the very end. It is really also a key question of how much time and space is given to the early career researchers structurally to engage in these activities. So, and part of that is actually it being recognized as crucial work that we are doing as part of the scientific community. And that it's not just kind of an add-on, but it really is to some extent also what anchors research and higher education in society. And at the same time, career path and the requirements at the moment are very much still focused on what we deliver as researchers. And in that sense, it doesn't get recognized or acknowledged the importance and just really the incredible amount of work that it is to be engaged at these interfaces. And I think that would be, and I do see, so I'd also do a lot of kind of developing courses for science policy, kind of giving the researchers and students the skills to actually engage there. And I think that is one of the biggest issues, that we have so many, actually, the young people, whether it's students or PhD candidates or early career researchers, they're really interested in this intersection. So we don't need kind of academic authorities or government authorities telling us that we should be more engaged and that we should think more about the social impact and the social benefit of what we're doing. But at the same time, what we're not given is the time and space to actually engage in that area. And I think that's, especially for researchers, kind of balancing all of these different demands is just a big challenge.
Yeah, very interesting, because I've heard this a lot when we've been, I mean, for me also, if we're talking about my entry point to science diplomacy, was just starting working with ASEF and in 2024 on this topic. And I did a lot of reading of articles and of the history of science diplomacy. And I did the old EU science diplomacy course online and all of these different things to kind of get my understanding. But as someone who is not currently even trying to get into the field, I'm just trying to get the understanding and see where we can contribute as an organization, only that takes a lot of time to get that understanding as well. So perhaps I know we just shared a couple of resources, and I'll put some also in the chat for those that are interested in learning more, both our own, but also, as I mentioned, the courses that are available out there. But perhaps let me direct to our alumni of our programs, to Kochapan, and also for Dimitris perhaps to come in as well. Kochapan, if you would like to start, when you've been learning about science diplomacy and starting to engage in this field, what resources and perhaps also people around you or institutions as well have been helpful in your process in building your science diplomacy toolbox and the understanding as well?
For me, the most helpful resources have been about like joining, participating in some initiatives and forums that allow me to learn. It's more about learning by doing. And yes, progressively. One more experience, which is the really important experience for me, is with the Asia Europe Foundation's initiative back in 2024, where at the time I served as a country informant for Thailand. Working with ASEF. This is the very first time that I become conscious about the science diplomacy as a field. And it gave me the opportunity to reflect on Thailand's STI ecosystems and diplomacy structure, understand and more aware of trying to understand the language of the science diplomacy and the language of the science policy, the community language, which is somehow like a comes with layers, totally different. And I was thinking about contributing how Thailand could experience on the science diplomacy could be positioned in the broader Asia-Europe dialogues. And I think another important experience was I back in my internship with the UN SCAP in 2023, where I engaged with the regional cooperation work that related to science, technology, and innovation in back home region. And through that experience, I learned that how regional dialogues and capacity building programs are designed and how different stakeholders identify mutual benefits and how technical topics like microplastics or cassava are translated into the policy cooperation, and how the international organization create the platforms for countries to learn from one another. Let's say in our regions, and more recently, last year, I participated in SCAP's communities of practice on artificial intelligence. It's called COPI, that helped me broaden my understandings of science diplomacy in the context of the emerging technologies. And for me, COPI showed that the science diplomacy can also happen through the communities of practice, knowledge exchange, peer learning, and capacity building, especially in the area like AI governance, which is where the countries may have different levels of readiness, but face the shared challenge. And beyond the formal initiatives, I also learned from the observing how international organizations communicate, how they frame issues, how they build consensus, how they manage different national contexts, and how they can turn the technical knowledge into practical cooperation. So my science diplomacy toolbox has been built through the combinations of the practical exposure, policy works, international forums, and reflection through all of these activities. And it includes a technical understanding, but also communication, stakeholder mappings, cultural sensitivities, political awareness, and the abilities to translate across the different policy and institutional languages. So yeah, that is my toolbox.
Thank you very much, Koshapan. I think what you mentioned here is, of course, very close to our heart in ASEF, where, of course, also the national context, and Dimitris also mentioned this is in his beginning statement, that building understanding not only of the national context, but the institutional context, the different working environments in both in countries, but also in institutions is very important, and how these international organizations, as you mentioned, provide that bridge in between the different understandings as well. But Demetrius, perhaps continuing on this field. So when we're talking about different resources in learning science diplomacy, of course, you're within your Penn Science Policy and Diplomacy group, you're in charge of running these programs and trying to determine what skills and what information is necessary for young students to know in order to get a grasp of science diplomacy and how they can work with it. What have you found to be helpful in this field, and how do you also go about determining the programs and the scope of the activities that you run at UPenn?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So our group is a student-led organization at the University of Pennsylvania, and as I mentioned, we are creating hands-on training and career development opportunities in science policy, science diplomacy, and science communication. So I'm leading the science diplomacy branch, and I think of our programming as a pipeline. And the reason why I'll be sharing this is in case, maybe it can act as a blueprint for attendees to maybe create, your own initiatives or your own group. So feel free to ask more specific questions if you have as well. I will be happy to answer. But at this pipeline that I described at the beginning, we need orientation. Students need to understand what science diplomacy means and why it matters. So we start with foundational programming, such as our Science Diplomacy 101 and introductory workshops. Then students need analytical depth. So we run reading groups and discussion-based events on topics that range from research security to energy security, vaccine diplomacy, biological weapons, climate diplomacy, and like discussions of the new science diplomacy frameworks. These discussions help our members to practice thinking across science, policy, and international relations. Then students need practice, right? And I think we've already kind of mentioned the importance of, practicing all of these skills. So this is where simulations come in, or policy writing, op-eds, stakeholder mapping, and project teams, where like all these things become important. Because it is one thing to know that science diplomacy exists, and it's another thing to practice writing a policy memo or moderating a discussion or mapping a stakeholder ecosystem or designing, a simulation scenario. And finally, as like the last part of the pipeline, the way that we have it at least, is that students need exposure to practitioners. So this is why we organize speaker events, embassy engagement, and we have our annual science diplomacy trip to Washington, D.C. And these experiences make it feel like the field feel more real, and our members can see what the work looks like and how different people entered it. And this year, I've also launched a new initiative that we now call Global Initiatives, which is a more project-based model. And students can join regional teams and work on science diplomacy challenges in direct collaboration with embassies and international stakeholders from that region. And I think this has been like really powerful for our members to get this exposure and also create some tangible outcomes at the end, instead of just attending a workshop, working on a project, and then like outputs may, depending on the team, may include from writing an op-ed to a local newspaper from that region that they're working on, or do an embassy briefing. We have a team that is going to DC to present the Embassy of Japan, for example, the Asian team, and things like that. As for the last part of your question, for like how we decide what PSPDG should cover, I think it really depends on the interest of our members. But I have some filters when trying to decide what to use. So first, is the topic globally relevant right now? Then, will it help students build a useful skill, or maybe it will be a network or like help their professional identity? And the last filter is can students do something concrete with it? And I think our strongest programming sits somewhere at the intersection of those three. So yeah, from all of this, I would like you to keep that student groups are not only, helping students find science diplomacy careers, but we are prototyping the educational models that the field needs that do not exist. So in the absence of formal pathways, graduate student groups can build this educational curriculum that is missing, or build the community, build the practical entry points for the next generation of science diplomacy professionals.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. So globally relevant, something that builds skills within the participants, and also that it leads to something concrete afterwards, be it an output or perhaps an action that they can take. I think that's very good, and perhaps something we'll also keep in mind as in our adaptation of activities. I think you mentioned you have this pipeline in mind, which I think builds and kind of slowly introduces different aspects of science diplomacy to participants. And of course, the last one is more the action and applying the skills and knowledge that they have been taught. And on this notion, we also have a question in the Q&A from a participant or attendee who is asking, we have Ernesto Anasio, who's asking in relation to all of the skills that have been brought up today from many of you. When it comes to science diplomacy, we have curiosity, communication, initiative has been brought up a lot, and of course, intercultural understanding and institutional understanding. Perhaps each of you, anyone who wants to grab the question, but I'll start out with Hannah first. As someone who is working in the intersection between different stakeholders and trying to facilitate them, can you share a little bit about the skills that you've had to apply in these scenarios, and also perhaps then the skills that are needed in these scenarios? So we've talked a lot about the need, but how have you applied them in your work as well? And then I would like to invite our other speakers to perhaps also share an anecdote about how you've applied these skills in action, also in science diplomacy in different skills.
So I think the most important skill is what commonly is summarized under the term facilitation, which can mean everything and nothing, basically. But what I've learned in my work is really, so what we do, and I think that is really important in a sense to, if you create a space where you bring these different stakeholders together, where you want them to actually talk to each other rather than just repeat the points that they usually make. So basically, whenever stakeholders are come into the room, you basically know the position of each. So that is not a mystery. So what you need if you want to actually move from the kind of debate where just everyone repeats the positions that they already have and we all know, is kind of, you have to move the practice somehow. And one way to do that is really kind of to make sure that the space is open, but also safe enough for people to actually, that they're not constantly thinking about politics in a sense, in how they represent each other, but that there is kind of this element of trust where they know in this room, we now speak together and not just kind of present. And then a lot of it is actually kind of really taking them out of what they usually do, so sitting on a panel next to each other, kind of, which already creates a certain dynamic, to what we do is put them in the room in small groups where they sit around in a circle, which is already changes the dynamic already completely, where we often pose them a kind of a question that is more of, what, from your experience and from your expertise, what are the challenges that you see on a given topic, and what are the openings? So it's less about what is your position on this, and more of like, what actually can you contribute to this? So we often also start with a brainstorming moment which people are luckily getting more used to. But it also means that they not just jump into the debate as the kind of, this is the first thought I have, and now I'm just going to talk. But you take them out at kind of 3 minutes, where the whole dynamic already shifts. So facilitation is, what I'm basically saying, facilitation is maybe the most important skill, but it's more than just moderating. It's really about thinking and creating the space differently. So you get the participants into the mode where they can actually talk and share their expertise rather than just lecturing. And I think one of the what is tricky at the moment with all of these buzzwords, of course, all these words have also become co-creation is also such a buzzword at the moment. That everyone, at least in Europe, it's like whenever you want to present something as innovative, you use co-creation and facilitation. And one of the dangers there really is that it's also just seen as, oh, it's just another label for moderation, or it's just another label to talk to people once. And it's not that. So actually taking the time to learn how to facilitate, learn how to co-create is, I think, really, really important. And this is maybe also to some extent my learning the last 3 years, that, you need to take the time to actually learn these skills. It's not something that you wake up one morning, even us as academics, we don't just wake up with new skills just because it's on the map of the EU now. So, but it's something that we also have to invest in, but which is also great because it means that we are also learning, which keeps kind of things interesting.
Thank you very much, Anna. Anyone else would like to come in? Perhaps, Renaud, you also have a lot of experience in working with different stakeholders, and how have you applied these skills that we've been talking about in different diplomatic scales, also as Danas mentioned in their question as well.
So very poorly. I was notoriously undiplomatic, apparently. But I think it goes through. You have to be a bit of an anthropologist. I think you have to understand where people come from, what kind of background they have, and as I think Dimitris mentioned, there are big differences in culture among scientific fields, sometimes shockingly so. So I think if you get involved in really transdisciplinary projects, you will sometimes bump into these things, right? So you have big differences in perception, language among the scientific fields. And then when you go to the diplomatic level, it is even more complex because you have different stakeholders have very different opinions, and the processes through which they work or the kind of training people add can be very, very different. And I think one thing that is important to realize is that science and data don't necessarily carry the day, and that was for me a bit of our learning experience. So because as a scientist I tend to think that we should make evidence in a data-driven way, but you will realize in a lot of these political decisions there are many stakeholders. Some of them are not around the table, and they will influence decisions through other channels. And you have to accommodate yourself with that and understand how decisions are made. My experience of discussions at the political level at the European Commission is that member states will come and read prepared statements. There is no real debate. It's more that and these prepared statements is not something that this guy made up in the morning before coming to the meeting. It will have gone through multiple channels. Maybe it will have involved the coordination among 7 different ministries, and they've been working on it for several months. So there is no real space there for discussions. I mean, it's more statements of positions. And I think the discussions, and I think Anna had a good point. I think it happens at networking events. It's a lot about building relationship and trust with people, so that you can shape decisions outside of the formal settings where usually there is little space for really adjusting positions or for changing opinions. And so it means that you need to come prepared for these meetings to read your own prepared statements, which was also a bit of a weird thing for me to do. You need to have done your homework and make your statements, and then the real diplomacy maybe doesn't happen in this fora specifically, but rather at the coffee breaks, at cocktail parties, and outside of what is the visible part of the process. And I think it's, as scientists, this is maybe, I don't know, I think it's maybe not very natural to do, because you're used to present your results at a conference, and this is usually one of the main channels through which you communicate your science. And in that space, you need to be aware that it's not because you have convincing evidence that this is how you're gonna shape decisions, and this needs to be done maybe via parallel channels and via building trust with the actors. Emotions sometimes matter a lot more than you would think. So it's better to have a good story to tell than having convincing data. And again, it's not very natural if you come from a STEM field, because this is usually exactly not how you communicate things, right? So you're talking often to people who don't have a technical training, and your best data-driven arguments might not be as convincing as you think. So it's entering a completely different. You also have to really adjust how you communicate and what you communicate about, I think. And I've seen very obvious examples of that, which I was very surprised about. So I think it's for coming from a STEM background, it's a bit of it's quite unnatural. So you have to learn how to communicate in a completely different way, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I think definitely, I mean, Dimitris mentioned also this being one of the branches of their organization and their initiative, science communication. How do you communicate science to different people, to the stakeholders involved, those affected, and then, of course, especially those that are the ones making the policy at the end of the day. I think this is a very important skill to be able to adjust and adapt, but may not always be the easiest. Well, I think comes from both sides. So of course, before this session, we had diplomacy impacting science and science impacting diplomacy. And whilst we went a little bit into it, you can also see the recordings that I shared in the chat from last year, where we also delved into this a little bit more. We see that there is both miscommunication and misunderstanding on both sides, both in communicating and listening, which we also discussed as a very important point as well. And how do we listen to understand the other side, which I think is very crucial.
Yes. I would just like quickly to amend maybe what Renaud has also said, and I think it's all true that a lot is happening in these kind of more informal settings. But I think we're also not good at knowing what the formal processes is, because we usually think like what we think is the main moment is basically the end of it. So the policy process is basically all that happens before you're in that room reading that statement. And we are really bad at knowing and seeing the process and those steps where we can actually get engaged in how something is kind of shaped and developed. And maybe just a small one, but a really underutilized kind of path at least in Europe, that we as the scientific community just don't use enough and don't use well, are, for example, public hearings. And public hearing, and we have both on national levels as well as on the EU level. They basically, that is standardized, the kind of round of public hearings where this is the moment when you give your input. And much of it also has to, the administration, whoever is responsible for it, has to work their way through. Of course, they don't have to pick everything up, but one would also I find it often also surprising in seeing how much they also pick up and how much attention they pay to it. And so I do think that's if we turn it around, if the other side would think that the main work of research is what is kind of presentation at the conference. That's basically what you do. That's basically how we approach politics and policy making. And it's just, it's just an absolute misconception. And of course, we're always disappointed if you think that's the moment when we should, when they should hear us, because that's definitely not the moment when anyone is listening anymore, because basically everything has been done. So really being aware of that enormous time that is before those flashy moments, I think that is important.
Thank you very much.
If I can say briefly two things about that, I think it's very true what Anna said. There is often, you have public consultations that the European Commission is organizing, for instance, and they will ask you, there's a new policy being implemented, and before it's implemented, they ask you or they ask stakeholders what they think about it. By that time, it's usually, they've been working on it for 2-3 years, and all the decisions have been made. You're sitting on the Titanic by then. There's very little margin to change the direction of the ship. So it means you really need to be active as early as possible in those informal settings before, I would say, the big decisions are ironed out and things are written down. Because by the time you have a written document, it went through multiple cycles at the national and international level, and then there's very little room to adjust things. And the other thing is what kind of people you're talking to. I remember that when we were trying to push for a bigger budget of research budget at the European level for the current framework program, you go to the national ministers of research and education, or however they are called in the different member states, or you go to the European Commission, to the parliamentary group that is responsible for research policy, and they will say, yeah, we should have a bigger budget. But you're just talking to the wrong people, because in the end, it's the ministries of finance in the member states who are going to make that decision. And so there's no point you're basically preaching to the choir, because you're talking to people who already think that this budget should be increased, but they are not controlling the purse. So you're just barking to the wrong tree. And so I think there's a lot to learn about understanding how specifically the process works, and understanding where the pressure points are, when and where the pressure points are, because otherwise you risk wasting your efforts in talking to people who essentially already agree with you, but don't have the power to make the key decisions.
Yeah, very important point. And again, ties back to the science communication, not only to adjust what you're saying, but also who you're speaking to get your point across. Very important point. I would like to shift our attention a little bit now, and we have received a question in the chat, and also something that I wanted to delve deeper into as well. A question, let's see if I find it here as well. Yes, from Itisam. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your Itisham, perhaps. Who is asking about the stage in which a country is kind of just starting out with science diplomacy, and how perhaps we can leverage that situation to engage more ourselves in the field. And of course, we have Dimitris here, who is doing a lot of good work in kind of starting up the initiative of science diplomacy and helping promote it in Greece, also in preparations for next year's third European Science Diplomacy Conference taking place in Greece. So perhaps, Dimitris, do you want to share a little bit about what the process has been like for you to engage people? Has it been difficult, and how can you leverage this situation to promote science diplomacy in the country?
Yeah, thank you. This is a really great question, and it's something that I've been thinking about for the past 3.5 years, I would say, because as I mentioned, I didn't know science diplomacy when I was in Greece. I only heard about it when I came to the US. And as you understand, there are very different countries, very different structures. The United States, as Professor Renaud Jolivet mentioned, had, like, historically at least, has had like enormous resources for science diplomacy, while Greece didn't. So I was thinking, how can we actually bring science diplomacy to Greece? And I think this might be relevant for many other countries as well, and many other people in the audience that are thinking, well, but if I'm from a smaller country where there is not really a national science diplomacy strategy yet, or there are people that don't even know science diplomacy exists as a field, what can we do? And to be absolutely honest with you, it has been challenging, but also super exciting because we get to shape these new developments. And one advice that I necessarily want to make sure that I don't forget to mention is that building the foundation, like you cannot control when your country will develop a science diplomacy framework, right? But what we can control is build the foundation so that when all these political moments align and all the stars align in the universe for that moment to happen in a smaller country, having a foundation and being prepared, I think, is of paramount importance. And just to share a personal experience, Linnea mentioned how we started the Greeks in Science Diplomacy network during the previous European Science Diplomacy Conference in Copenhagen in Denmark. And we just came together and we decided that, oh, we should do something. All the Greeks from the diaspora come together and build this network. And that was a day before we learned that the next Science Diplomacy Conference, the third European Science Diplomacy Conference, will be held in Athens in 2027. So that was the day before, and we had already said, let's start building a network. Let's start connecting all these people, either from abroad or within the country, that are interested in science diplomacy, to start building this foundation. And then the next day, the announcement is that the conference will be in Athens, which means that the country will have to make some progress on that. So building the foundation, you never know when the stars will align, so that progress will be made and traction will be made. And the other thing that Lina, you asked that I think is pretty important to mention was like how difficult it was for our voice to be heard in this, field during the infancy in a country like Greece. And to be absolutely honest with you again, I think it can be difficult. And Greece, like many other countries, have strong respect for hierarchy, seniority, and formal titles. So as an early career professionals, it can be hard to be very involved with these initiatives. But this structure is not necessarily a bad thing because we often deal with serious institutions and high-stake questions, so experience really matters. But as I said, it can be hard for people like us, early career scientists, to see where we fit. So what I've learned through this process from Greece that I think can be translated to the question for Pakistan or maybe other countries as well, is that the most effective way to be heard is not simply to just say young people should be included in the discussions, but to show how young people are already building stuff. And we, as early career scientists, we have a very specific kind of power because we understand the entry barriers, because we're living them. We know what training is missing. We know how difficult it can be to move from interest to action. So that gives us a unique perspective when designing these entry points into the field. And in my experience for Greece, I have tried to make one argument clear, that if we want a future science diplomacy workforce, then training cannot begin only when somebody becomes a senior diplomat or a senior scientist or a ministry official. It has to start early. It has to start with universities, with graduate programs, with different student groups, as we mentioned, or like all these early career networks. And that argument has helped me personally contribute to conversations, making the case that an early career perspective is not symbolic. It's practical. It tells us how this pipeline begins. So my advice to those in similar situations that are trying to build science diplomacy in their home countries is to combine humility with specificity. Respect people's experiences, learn the institutional context, but also be clear about the value you bring. And don't just ask for visibility, but offer a concrete contribution. Because saying things like, I can help bring in students, I can organize a workshop, I can translate this discussion into university level training, this is harder to ignore because it's actually useful. And if I can add one more thing on this conversation that I think is also important to mention is for who is responsible for building these skills, because I think I've been saying also in my intro remarks, but now about the importance of individuals, the initiative and how this can open doors and how we need curiosity, courage, the willingness to reach out. But I think it's important to also mention the role of institutions on this and formal structures, because these are what make this pathway fair, visible, and reproducible. Because we should not build a field where only the most extroverted or well-connected students can find their way in. So we need this formal structure with fellowships, internships, student groups, different mentorship programs, things like that, because this is what can turn like hidden opportunities into real entry points for countries like Greece or other countries as well.
Thank you very much for sharing. I think you give a lot of examples, but also showing that there needs to be a balance of top-down approach and bottom-up. That starting from the lower levels, seeing how we can contribute and not taking a no for an answer, but then also these formal structures that you mentioned to really help
exactly
the building. Yeah, very important. Thank you very much. I see we're coming a bit to a close of today's session. So perhaps I will invite each of our speaker here today to share some final remarks. So we've talked a lot about the different skills that are needed, given some examples of when and how they're applied, perhaps easier in theory than in practice sometimes on facilitating these connections between different stakeholders. We talk a lot about understanding the ecosystem, but also that it takes a lot of effort from everyone involved. And I want to emphasize here that you shouldn't be discouraged by this. It should be kind of a flame to let you get started and start delving into this very exciting and big and vast field of science diplomacy. Start learning, start contributing and seeing how the different dots start connecting for you. Don't be afraid that you don't understand everything all at once, because what we've learned from today's speakers is that they're still learning, they're still puzzling things together and seeing also how the different stakeholders work with each other, sometimes maybe dysfunctionally, according to Renaud and other speakers as well. But anyhow, very, very important to not see it as a discouragement, but a way for you to start out. Perhaps then, if I allow Kochapan to start with your final remarks to our attendees today, anything you would like to leave off with? How can they continue their journey in science diplomacy? And if there's one thing that they should take away from today, what should that be for you?
Thank you. I think science diplomacy is not just only about formal setting, formal position like diplomats or just only for the scientists, but it is a practical skill. We can see that today we speak a lot about the practical skill sets for anyone who wants to connect the knowledge, policies, and the people across borders. Because science, technologies, and innovations are actually constantly evolving. So our learning journey also has to remain dynamic by nature, and science diplomacy can help us address shared challenges and build capacity, reducing barriers and open new dimensions of cooperation. So especially in the areas where no single countries or institutions can solve the problem alone, like for example, environmental challenges. And for those who want to continue learning, I would encourage you to start by observing the ecosystem around you, like who are the stakeholders, what are their interests or constraints, what kinds of language do they use, like maybe the frame is differently, and like technical or policy or diplomatics or business community-based, and how can we translate across those languages so that the cooperation become easier and more meaningful. And if there's one thing that I hope you guys takes away from today's webinar, it is science diplomacy begins with the connection, connecting the evidence with the policy, institution with the people, and national priorities with the shared global challenges. The more we learn to build those bridges, and the more we can turn science and technology into the space for trust and capacity building and collective actions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Coach Apan, for those words and encouragements for our participants. Hannah, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you. I mean, much has been said, but maybe one thing that also seeing so many people actually showing up for a webinar like this is, I think, really gives also hope. Seeing how many are interested in this and taking it seriously. And I think there's also there's so much work that needs to be done on the science policy level, on the skill building level, on so many levels, but also it also means that it needs so many of us, and there's so much that we can also do in small. So there's also a lot of, in that sense, agency and possibilities to shape in this area. And I think that is really, and getting so many more people involved contributing to this, I think, is something that really gives me hope also for kind of the relationship of science and research to society and to politics, to how we build community and how we build the world that we are in. So in a sense, if you're interested and if you're passionate about this, we need you at this interface. There's much we can contribute. And at the same time, there are so many people who are contributing and who are doing fantastic work, because it needs all of the tiny puzzle pieces and all of the aspects that need to be considered. I mean, people have mentioned the climate crisis, like AI has been mentioned. So many challenges that we are facing, and for each and every one of them, we need people working on that. And actually now seeing so many people interested, so many young people interested in that, I think it kind of gives us a chance.
That's very good. Call to action to everyone here in the call to take the initiative and contribute themselves. Very great. Dimitris, do you would like to offer your final points?
Yeah, I think my final message to all students here is, again, pretty clear and consistent. It is, do not wait for permission to begin. As we've said, science diplomacy can sound like something that only happens in ministries, embassies, international organizations, or high-level conferences. But as we said, the first step can be smaller. Join or start a student group at your university. Invite a speaker, write a policy memo, or reach out to your local embassy, or activities like that. And I hope we've persuaded you throughout the workshop already, but for those who want to continue and do more after today, I would suggest 4 practical steps. The first one is learn the basic language in the field and read a few science diplomacy frameworks and reports. You've probably already seen the AAAS and Royal Society and the EU have update frameworks last year. These are a good start. Then map the ecosystem around you. We've also mentioned about that during this workshop. So who are the scientists? Who are the policymakers, the diplomats that are most relevant to what you want to do? And they might not necessarily call themselves science diplomats. You will see that, but their work might be exactly that of what we define as science diplomacy. The third one is to practice writing for non-specialists. And last but not least, we've alluded to that as well, is to find or build a community, because science diplomacy is not a solo activity. So yeah, I think, as I said, do not wait for permission to begin. And now is the time to shape the future of science diplomacy.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dimitris. Last but not least, Professor Renaud.
Yes, I'm not quite sure what to add. I think these are all excellent comments. I think I didn't mean to be discouraging. I think, on the contrary, I mean, we need more people in that interface, and especially because historically, science has often acted as a diplomatic back channel in troubled periods. Since we seem to be heading for one, I think it's more important than ever. Then we have people there who can really communicate outside of maybe the typical political or diplomatic channels. Who can also bring a scientific or engineering or humanities mindset to the problems that we are going to face. Because I think it's pretty clear that we are headed for difficult periods. If only because of climate change, and the solutions will be technological and scientific. At least part of the solutions will be the technological and scientific. So I think it's more important than ever than more people like us are involved in decision making. And so I think it's a call to action rather than and don't get flustered by the complexity of the landscape. You will learn it as you go. I think you don't need to know in advance how things are organized. You need to stay humble, as some of the other panelists have said. Be respectful of the people who are already in that space, but in no way should you take the lack of structure as a problem. I mean, I think you can just start, as Dimitri said. I think he gave very good advice on how to start from scratch. And I think really we need more people with that mindset rather than fewer.
Very lovely. Thank you so much. And I didn't mean to say that was any discouragement. I think if anything, perhaps this what we can take away from today is that it is a very complex field, but that there are many stakeholders involved. But this also means that there is room for more. There is room for you to get involved. There's room for you to contribute. It's so somewhat formal, somewhat informal. So just take the step. Do not wait for permission, as we've been told, and tied to start your journey today. So with that, we're actually coming to a close of the dialogue and today's session. I'm sorry for those that we run over just a little bit today, but I hope you're there with me as I just make some closing remarks as well. Thank you so much to our speakers for being with us here today, for your contributions and points of encouragement also for our attendees and how they can take this initiative and spot the different entry points to science diplomacy. As we've learned today, there are many, and that just means that you just need to pick one and see how you can delve from it. But that is the end of today's session. Thank you so much for everyone for being with us here today. If you have not watched the previous two sessions that we had on science impacting diplomacy and diplomacy impacting science, you can access the recordings of the sessions if you just scan the QR code or access our website as well. But we have our last session taking place next week on careers in science diplomacy. So now we talked a little about entry points, but we'll bring in a couple of practitioners now also next week to share a little bit about what they do, how they interact in this field, and also then perhaps see if there's something that you're interested in pursuing yourself. So again, thank you so much for being with us here today. I hope that you take this as your first step towards a science diplomacy career. And we hope to see you again next week for our final Wednesday together for this webinar series. Thank you for joining us. For those of you joining from Europe, have a good rest of your day. So those of you joining us from Asia, good rest of your evening or afternoon. For New Zealand, Australia, perhaps good night is in order. And also again to Dimitris from joining us from the US. I hope you get a couple of extra hours of sleep now before your day officially begins for the Wednesday. So thank you all, and we hope to see you again next week. Goodbye.